Midnight smothered Dry Creek when a rifle cracked the darkened glass burst from the saloon like ice in wind. Jesse Hale stepped from the freight shadows and kept his hands low. He counted lamplights, exits, and faces behind curtains. Jesse Hale said, "Easy, you ghosts. I came to return what never should have left." A second shot snapped a sign rope, and the plank creaked like a neck. Eli Turner hissed from the alley, "They know your boots, Jesse." Jesse Hale said, "They know my shadow, not my aim." Sheriff Pike's star glinted at the far end like a cold moon. Rosa Delaney watched from the balcony with her jaw set and her eyes unreadable. Jesse Hale said, "Show yourself, Sheriff, or show me the ledger." Wind rolled the dust and carried the smell of spilled rye and iron. A piano string hummed a thin death note, and then went still. Jesse Hale said, "I did not pull the trigger at Flint Creek, and you know it." The town held its breath as if truth were a rattler coiled under the boards. Dawn bled into the desert like a wound that refused to close. Jesse Hale walked the quiet street and counted the sins he carried. He kept a ledger in mind, the one Pike hid to seal a lie. Rosa Delaney stepped down from the balcony and matched his pace in silence. Jesse Hale said, "You watched the rope last night, not me." Rosa Delaney said, "I watch what hangs people, not who." The bank door clicked, and a clerk pretended to sweep. Eli Turner trailed them like a stray with sharp eyes. Jesse Hale said, "You should ride home, kid." Eli Turner said, "Someone has to see truth get its boots on." The church bell tolled a thin hour, and then went hollow. Jesse Hale said, "I came back for one thing, and I leave when it breathes daylight." He felt the town measure his steps and find them lacking. Rosa Delaney said, "Then make daylight arrive where Pike keeps night." The wind turned and carried the smell of rain that never came. The jail squatted like a locked jaw and the bars sweated night air. Jesse Hale said, "He keeps bodies and truths in the same box." Eli Turner said, "You sure the ledger lives here?" Jesse Hale said, "I am sure Pike fears it more than me." Footsteps scraped inside and a deputy coughed a warning. Rosa Delaney said, "He rotated keys after midnight." Jesse Hale studied the door and counted the seconds between breaths. He traced the hinge pins with his eyes and found the weak one. Jesse Hale said, "Steel is only strong where men believe it." A wagon rolled past and covered their talk with wheel noise. Eli Turner said, "I can make a racket at the livery." Rosa Delaney said, "No, the clerk at the bank trembles easier." Jesse Hale said, "Hold your ground, both of you." He set his palm on the wood and felt the heartbeat of a town that wanted lies to sit still. They cut through the alley where rain barrels slept under soot. Rosa Delaney said, "The clerk holds a safe key and a soft fear." Jesse Hale said, "Fear opens faster than steel." Eli Turner said, "I can carry a message he cannot ignore." Jesse Hale said, "You will carry only your breath and keep it steady." A cat sprang from crates and vanished into rags. Jesse Hale said, "Pike will stage a gallows and call it justice." Rosa Delaney said, "Then we must stage daylight first." The church bell tried again, and failed to make courage ring. Jesse Hale said, "If the ledger does not speak, I will not." He remembered a creek bank and a name written in blood dust. Eli Turner said, "You do not have to carry all of it." Jesse Hale said, "I carry what I wrote by leaving." He touched the alley brick and felt grit like a promise. The bank doors breathed wealth and dust when they stepped inside. The clerk's hands shook like leaves that knew winter too well. Jesse Hale said, "You keep a ledger with names that do not match graves." The clerk blinked and stared at the floor seam. Rosa Delaney said, "This town wants a morning without lies." The vault loomed with brass that pretended to be holy. Eli Turner said, "He will call Pike if we falter." Jesse Hale said, "Then do not." The clerk's lower lip quivered and then steadied on a choice. He nodded toward a drawer that pretended to be ordinary. Jesse Hale said, "Open it slow and breathe slower." Outside a horse snorted, and the street murmured like a jury. Rosa Delaney said, "Once we touch it, the day will start for real." The drawers slid and paper edges lifted like a sigh that might save or ruin them. Jesse Hale walked into the dusty street with the ledger hidden beneath his coat, the town watching him like vultures from behind cracked shutters. Eli Turner said, "The words in there could burn Pike's empire." Jesse Hale said, "Truth is flint. It sparks only when struck." Rosa Delaney moved beside him, her face pale with resolve, her eyes flicking to the church where whispers grew louder. Jesse Hale said, "They will test us with fear before noon." A crow flapped from the gallows beam and broke the silence. Rosa Delaney said, "Fear bends weak men but not stone." Eli Turner said, "Then we must be stone." Jesse Hale's hand brushed his revolver, but his grip held on the paper instead. The streets hummed with the sound of unseen lawmen, shifting in shadows. Jesse Hale said, "They will come smiling, and they will leave bloodied." He took one steady breath and walked forward. Sheriff Pike strode out of the jail with his coat drawn tight and his star gleaming like a blade. Sheriff Pike said, "Ledger or no ledger, I own every inch of this dirt." Jesse Hale said, "Dirt cannot be owned, only remembered by the dead who bled in it." Rosa Delaney stood firm at Jesse's side, her voice cutting sharp. Rosa Delaney said, "You hide behind law, not justice." Sheriff Pike's eyes narrowed, and he tipped his hat, the gesture cold as winter. Eli Turner whispered, "He has men in the alleys." Jesse Hale said, "Then we keep walking, not running." The crowd murmured, shifting like dry grass in a storm. Sheriff Pike said, "You came for ghosts, Jesse, and ghosts don't testify." Jesse Hale said, "But ink does." The ledger pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The church bell tolled noon, sharp and hollow. Jesse Hale said, "Every toll counts the lie you fed them, Pike." Sheriff Pike said, "Every toll counts the law you broke." Eli Turner stepped forward, trembling but defiant. Eli Turner said, "We all saw the smoke at Flint Creek, and your men carried the matches." The crowd gasped, the sound like dry timber snapping. Sheriff Pike's lips curled into a cold smile. Sheriff Pike said, "A boy's word is worth less than the dust he kicks." Jesse Hale said, "But the ledger weighs more than your badge." Rosa Delaney held the gaze of the townsfolk, her eyes pulling them into the fight. Rosa Delaney said, "Ask yourselves who profits from silence." The air grew heavy, as if thunder was crouched just beyond the horizon. The townsfolk shuffled closer, faces uncertain, caught between fear and truth. Jesse Hale said, "If you carry doubt, you carry Pike's chain." Sheriff Pike said, "Doubt keeps you alive, Jesse." Rosa Delaney turned to the clerk who lingered near the bank. Rosa Delaney said, "Tell them what you gave to Pike." The clerk stammered, his hands shaking like reeds in wind. The silence threatened to crush him, but Jesse Hale steadied his gaze. Jesse Hale said, "One word can turn shadows into light." The clerk's lips parted, and a whisper slipped out. Clerk said, "The ledger is real." The crowd erupted into murmurs, shifting with sudden fire. Eli Turner said, "Now it breathes." The sky felt closer, pressing heavy with the weight of decision. Sheriff Pike's hand twitched near his revolver, and silence cracked like glass. Jesse Hale said, "Draw and you end this by lead, not by law." Rosa Delaney said, "You cannot bury truth with bullets." Eli Turner stepped closer, his voice sharp with new courage. Eli Turner said, "This town knows your gallows are built from lies." Sheriff Pike's eyes flicked to the crowd, calculating their shift. Jesse Hale said, "One move, Pike, and your star turns to iron around your neck." The wind carried the heat and pressed dust against every face. The people whispered Jesse's name, no longer afraid to be heard. Sheriff Pike said, "Then let us see who the town follows." He steadied his stance, but for the first time, his hand trembled. The sun slid lower and painted the town in copper and shadow. "Jesse Hale," said Pike, "bleeds trust from every crack of this place." Rosa Delaney replied, Then we must cut the vein open where all can see. Eli Turner tugged his collar, nerves thick in his throat. Eli Turner said, "If we show them the ledger, we paint a target on us." Jesse Hale answered, "The target already rests between my shoulders." Sheriff Pike leaned on the porch rail across the street, calm as a stone idol. Sheriff Pike said, "You parade ghosts, Jesse, but none will testify." Rosa Delaney said, "Paper testifies louder than blood." The people shifted, caught between two worlds. Jesse Hale said, "When the sun drops, so does his mask." The sky burned orange as silence wrapped the square. The saloon doors groaned open, and Pike's hired men spilled out, rough faces lit by lamplight. Jesse Hale said, "There's your truth, Rosa," paid hands with empty eyes. Eli Turner whispered, "They outnumber us." Rosa Delaney said, "But not the truth." Sheriff Pike barked, "Step aside or get buried under my dust." Jesse Hale said, "You'll choke on your own dust first." Tension wrapped every glance as boots scraped boards. A drunk staggered past and tripped over silence. The ledger in Jesse's coat felt like iron chained to his ribs. Rosa Delaney said, "We must hold the street, not yield it." Eli Turner clenched his fists and forced his breath even. The crowd shifted back as Pike's men formed a line, rifles gleaming. Jesse Hale said, "He hides behind numbers." Sheriff Pike said, "Law writes its strength in head count." Rosa Delaney said, "Law without justice is only tyranny." A deputy shouted for Jesse's arrest. Eli Turner said, "They mean to break us now." Jesse Hale replied, "Then we break their silence instead." He drew the ledger and raised it high. Jesse Hale said, "This book holds the names of every bribe, every gallows paid for with blood." The people gasped, and Pike's jaw clenched. Pike's voice cut through the crowd. Sheriff Pike said, "That ledger is theft, and theft is a hanging crime." Jesse Hale said, "Hanging men for truth is your only trade." Rosa Delaney said, "You wrote this crime in ink, Pike, and now it stains you." Eli Turner shouted, "You killed at Flint Creek, and here is proof." A ripple of rage swept through the people. Jesse Hale said, "You can silence one voice, but not all of them." Pike's hand twitched toward his gun. The crowd's anger burned hotter than the sun that had slipped away. The church bell struck once, loud as thunder, freezing the town in place. Jesse Hale said, "When that bell tolls, it tolls for your lies." Sheriff Pike snapped, "Then it tolls for you." Rosa Delaney said, "No, it tolls for Dry Creek's last chance to stand." Eli Turner stepped forward, his voice strong. Eli Turner said, "I stand with Jesse, and so should you all." The townsfolk murmured, stepping closer, their courage waking. Jesse Hale said, "This ends not with one gun but with many voices." Sheriff Pike's face twitched, fury breaking his calm mask. The ledger's weight pulled Jesse's arm down, but his spirit rose higher. The night deepened as torches flared, throwing jagged shadows on the walls of Dry Creek. Jesse Hale said, "He will not fight fair, Rosa." Rosa Delaney replied, "Fair was buried long ago." Sheriff Pike emerged with deputies, their rifles glinting like snakes' teeth. Sheriff Pike said, "You want truth, Jesse. I will carve it from your hide." Eli Turner's voice cracked but held strong. Eli Turner said, "The town is watching, Pike." The people huddled in silence, their fear choking the air. Jesse Hale said, "Your mask slips tonight." Sheriff Pike sneered, "This star shines brighter than your ledger." Rosa Delaney whispered, "Then let us break his star." The wind carried ash from the torches, and the square glowed like a furnace about to erupt. Sheriff Pike held a hand aloft, his voice sharp as steel. Sheriff Pike said, "Seize him." Deputies lunged forward, but the townsfolk shifted, blocking their path. Rosa Delaney said, "You see, Pike, fear no longer binds them." Jesse Hale said, "The ground beneath you crumbles." Eli Turner shouted, "No more gallows built with lies." The clerk stepped from the crowd, pale but determined. Clerk said, "The ledger speaks true. and I have seen its pages." A murmur roared into anger as voices rose together. "Jesse Hale," said this town has chosen. Sheriff Pike's jaw tightened as his grip brushed the revolver, eyes flicking with rage. Sheriff Pike's men hesitated, their eyes betraying doubt. Jesse Hale said, "Your law dies when its soldiers refuse it." Rosa Delaney said, "Even your own know the truth." Sheriff Pike barked, "Stand firm or fall with him." Eli Turner said, "They fear justice more than your wrath now." The crowd pressed closer, their courage hardening with every word. Jesse Hale raised the ledger high once more. Jesse Hale said, "These names will not vanish with gunfire." Pike's hand shook as he drew his revolver, eyes wild. Sheriff Pike said, "Then I erase them with lead." The town froze, waiting for the crack of a bullet or the rise of dawn. The revolver cleared its leather, gleaming under firelight. Rosa Delaney shouted, "Jesse!" He stood unmoved, his eyes locked with Pike's. Jesse Hale said, "If you fire on truth itself." Eli Turner stepped in front, chest heaving. Eli Turner said, "You'll have to shoot me first." Sheriff Pike's face twisted, rage clawing against fear. The people's voices rose, a chant swelling, drowning the silence. Jesse Hale said, "Hear them, Pike. You've already lost." Sheriff Pike's revolver hand shook harder, his breath ragged. Rosa Delaney whispered, "The mask has fallen." The night seemed to wait for his next move, the fire crackling like thunder. A scream broke as the clerk stepped forward again. Clerk said, "Enough blood. The ledger proves his guilt." Sheriff Pike's arm dropped an inch, his certainty crumbling. Jesse Hale said, "This town no longer kneels." Rosa Delaney said, "Choose now, Pike, truth or ruin." The crowd surged like a rising tide, faces lit with fury and hope. Eli Turner said, "We stand together." Sheriff Pike looked around, trapped in the circle of his own making. His revolver lowered, the steel dull under torchlight. Jesse Hale said, "Then justice breathes again." The chant swelled into a roar, and the night no longer belonged to Pike. The town square still echoed with the roar of voices when Pike's deputies lowered their rifles, eyes unsteady. Jesse Hale said, "The chain breaks when the first link bends." Rosa Delaney said, "He is no longer their law, only their shadow." Eli Turner stepped closer, his young voice rising. Eli Turner said, "Then let him stand as any man must, without a badge." Sheriff Pike's face tightened, the weight of lost power dragging him down. Jesse Hale said, "One man against truth cannot win." The clerk's whisper grew into courage. Clerk said, "We saw you take blood for silver." The crowd muttered, their anger sharpening. Pike's hand trembled near his revolver, caught between pride and survival. Jesse Hale said, "Choose wisely, Pike, for the desert buries pride faster than bodies." Sheriff Pike snarled, his teeth bared like a cornered wolf. Sheriff Pike said, without fear, "This town is nothing but dust." Jesse Hale said, "Without justice, fear is only rot." Rosa Delaney said, "Your words fall hollow now." Pike's deputies shifted uneasily, some lowering their heads. Eli Turner said, "You cannot buy silence anymore." Pike drew a ragged breath, rage boiling against loss. Jesse Hale said, "Step down, Pike, or bleed for your lies." Pike barked, "I do not step down." His revolver scraped leather, flashing in firelight. The crowd gasped as the square held its breath, the night wound tight like a noose ready to snap. The revolver gleamed, lifted halfway, but hesitation cracked Pike's strength. Jesse Hale said, "Even your hand betrays you." Rosa Delaney said, "His truth is shaking more than his hand." Eli Turner shouted, "The law does not belong to him anymore." The crowd's voices swelled, drowning Pike's defiance. Sheriff Pike screamed, "Silence!" His revolver raised high, but his aim wavered. Jesse Hale said, "Pull that trigger and bury yourself with it." Pike's breath grew ragged, sweat dripping as the firelight revealed the cracks in his mask. The ledger pressed heavy against Jesse's chest, but his voice carried weight enough for all. The church bell struck midnight, the sound rolling like judgment over the square. Jesse Hale said, "Hear it, Pike, it tolls for the guilty." Rosa Delaney said, "Your time ends with the stroke of that bell." Pike shook, his revolver dipping lower as the chant of the crowd rose louder. Eli Turner said, "This town will not bend again." The clerk's voice cracked but held. Clerk said, "We name you thief and murderer." Pike's knees buckled slightly, the power drained from his frame. Jesse Hale said, "Lay down the gun, Pike, or the ground will take you." The final echo of the bell faded, leaving silence as thick as a grave. Sheriff Pike dropped the revolver, the clang echoing like thunder. The crowd roared, their chains breaking with the sound. Jesse Hale said, "The law belongs to those who guard truth, not those who buy silence." Rosa Delaney said, "Dry Creek breathes again tonight." Eli Turner lifted his voice, trembling but strong. Eli Turner said, "The gallows will never own us again." The clerk wept, his relief spilling like rain on parched soil. Sheriff Pike glared with hollow eyes, the star on his chest now dull and meaningless. Jesse Hale said, "You are no sheriff, only a man stripped bare." The townsfolk surged, their unity louder than any bullet ever fired. The square emptied slowly, leaving only the torch smoke curling toward the midnight sky. Jesse Hale stood still, his chest rising heavy with the weight of a victory not yet claimed. Rosa Delaney said, "The crowd thinks it's done, but Pike's venom lingers." Eli Turner said, "The deputies may still turn." Jesse Hale answered, "Then their choice comes at dawn." Sheriff Pike slumped against the saloon rail, breathing ragged, his badge dull in the fire's dying glow. Jesse Hale said, "Your power broke like glass, Pike." Sheriff Pike muttered, "Glass cuts deeper when shattered." Rosa Delaney whispered, "He will not leave quietly." The silence pressed, heavy as the desert before a storm. The church bell tower loomed above, dark against the stars, its silence heavier than its toll. Jesse Hale said, "The dawn will ask more of us." Rosa Delaney said, "And it will strip the last mask from him." Eli Turner said, "What if his men gather in the dark?" Jesse Hale answered, "Then the dark will bear witness to their fall." Sheriff Pike staggered forward, eyes wild with desperation. Sheriff Pike said, "You think you've won, but you've only woken wolves." Rosa Delaney said, "Better wolves than cowards." The torch smoke drifted into the heavens, curling like prayers for justice not yet sealed. The ledger lay heavy in Jesse's hand, edges rough against his palm. Jesse Hale said, "This paper ends him, but it also binds me." Rosa Delaney said, "It binds you only if you carry it alone." Eli Turner said, "Then share it with us." Jesse Hale looked at their faces, steady in firelight, and nodded. Jesse Hale said, "Then the truth belongs to all." He raised the ledger and tore a page free, handing it to Rosa and another to Eli. Sheriff Pike snarled, "You split lies like bread." Jesse Hale said, "No, Pike, we break chains." The torch crackled, and the town seemed to lean in closer, though the square stood empty. The night air thickened, heavy with the weight of choices made. Jesse Hale said, "At dawn we end it with proof or with blood." Rosa Delaney said, "Proof first, blood only if forced." Eli Turner said, "The people are with us now." Jesse Hale answered, "They must hold when shots ring." Sheriff Pike's shadow stretched long across the dust, his voice hollow. Sheriff Pike said, "You can burn me, but you'll never bury my reach." Jesse Hale said, "The desert buries all." The fire cracked one last time before fading into silence, leaving the four figures caught in a web of fate. Dawn's first light crept over the desert ridge, soft and cold. Jesse Hale stood at the edge of town, the ledger tucked safe in his coat. Jesse Hale said, "This day will carve Dry Creek's future." Rosa Delaney said, "It will carve yours as well." Eli Turner said, "Then let it carve us all into stone." Sheriff Pike stumbled after them, face pale in the pale dawn. Sheriff Pike said, "You think light cleanses? It blinds." Jesse Hale said, "No, Pike, it reveals." The sun rose, burning the last of the shadows away, and the square waited like an altar, ready for sacrifice or salvation. The first rays of dawn painted Dry Creek in pale gold. As Jesse Hale stepped into the square, Ledger clutched close. Rosa Delaney said, "The sun judges today." Eli Turner said, "The people will follow your lead." Sheriff Pike staggered forward, hollow-eyed, his star dangling loose. Jesse Hale said, "This is where truth is spoken, not hidden." The crowd gathered quietly, their whispers heavy with expectation. Pike spat dust, his voice broken. Sheriff Pike said, "I will not beg for mercy." Jesse Hale said, "Then stand trial in daylight." The people pressed closer, voices rising like an approaching storm. Jesse Hale said, "This book holds the weight of every man lost to Pike's gallows." Rosa Delaney said, "It holds the price of freedom stolen." Eli Turner said, "No badge can erase blood written here." Sheriff Pike barked, "You think paper can hang me?" Jesse Hale said, "Paper doesn't hang you, truth does." The crowd erupted, their courage finally unchained. Pike's shoulders slumped as the town's judgment bore down. Jesse Hale stepped forward, laying the ledger on a crate in the center of the square. Jesse Hale said, "Let every eye see the truth." Rosa Delaney opened it, her fingers tracing inked names. Rosa Delaney said, "Each page is a testimony against him." Eli Turner said, "Flint Creek was not an accident, it was murder." Sheriff Pike's voice cracked. Sheriff Pike said, "They followed my orders, not me." Jesse Hale said, "A man who hides behind others hides from himself." The crowd roared, the truth burning brighter than the sun. The townsfolk surged, their chants pounding like drums. Jesse Hale said, "Your law ends here, Pike." Rosa Delaney said, "Your chains are broken." Eli Turner shouted, "Dry Creek belongs to its people." Sheriff Pike collapsed to his knees, rage collapsing into despair. Sheriff Pike said, "I built this town with fear." Jesse Hale said, "And we will rebuild it with truth." The morning air rang with a freedom no bullet could silence. The town finally stood unbound. Silence fell as Jesse Hale turned from Pike and faced the horizon. Jesse Hale said, "The desert keeps its scars, but it also grows new roots." Rosa Delaney said, "Then let us sow something worth remembering." Eli Turner said, "And carry it forward." Sheriff Pike was led away, the last shadow of fear leaving Dry Creek. The crowd dispersed, hope heavy in the air. Jesse Hale walked to the edge of town, boots crunching in dust. He paused, the sun framing his silhouette. Jesse Hale said, "The code lives not in guns, but in truth." He stepped onward, a lone figure carrying both scars and redemption, into the endless desert.